Hello, welcome to Full Record Jacket, you music lovers around the world. I'm Phil. There's
I'm the
Ben.
other one.
Yeah, and
Hi.
welcome to a monster edition. Yeah, we've got a big, scary one for you today. Let's get straight into it, shall we? Because we are talking about the album that came out in 1994 from R.E.M. It is Monster. Now, this is an interesting album.
1994.
Yeah,
Yes. It's
interesting
a
album.
bear on the front.
It is a bear. Yeah. Apparently, it's on the side of a balloon. Apparently,
1994. How old are you then? 52?
something like that. Yeah, maybe
I was going to
51.
say.
Now, the reason we're doing this, you ever had an album that you've had in your life for quite a while, and you've maybe liked it over the years, and you've known it for a very long time, you know it well, and you've got a friend who's never really heard it, so you give it to your friend and get them to listen to it. Well, that's what we've done because I'm the one who's familiar with the album, and Ben, you hadn't listened to it till last week.
Yeah, then I listened to it a little bit more today.
Okay.
It's got slightly easier with the more listens. But yeah, it's hard going. I'll
Now
say that about the album.
I'm the R.E.M. nerd. I mean, my history with R.E.M. is I was a fan of them when the album came out, and I bought it dutifully in the first week. And I don't want to go on too much about that. But Ben, you were not really an R.E.M. fan, so
No,
this is
no.
why. So tell us, where do you stand on R.E.M.? Where have you stood over the years?
Meh. That's about it. Singles. They're one of those bands like Coldplay. But then again, the first couple of Coldplay albums are good albums. But with REM, it's always been, you know, them for the singles, Man on the Moon, Everybody Hurts, Shiny Happy
That's
People, all
because you
that sort
listen
of
to the
stuff.
radio and don't buy the CD.
I've got a lot of CDs though, Phil. I just haven't got any REM ones. Well,
So that
I do own some REM vinyl, and I think I may have Out of Time on CD, but that's only because I saw it in Poundland once. So
that's what happens when you don't buy the albums. You only know the
the
singles.
singles, yeah. I've just never been a massive fan. I've always sort of found them a bit. There's nothing in them that says "listen to me." You know, there's nothing that captures my soul and says, "Yeah, you've been taken over."
Now they
It's
did have
just so
a bit of a run-in with your favourite band on one occasion, didn't they? In the 90s with Oasis, wasn't there some kind of?
they did after I think Oasis supported them in Ireland. I think it was in Ireland, and they've had a bit of a running beef. Well, there was a period where they had this sort of, well, probably Oasis probably had more disdain for REM than REM did. I don't know. There are other videos available that talk in depth about that sort of. I don't
Yeah,
know too much about it, but I know there was some beef, man.
there was some beef. Noel and Liam's laddishness that kind of clashed with Michael's liberal sensibilities or something like that, or I don't know, but it was.
His makeup or
They were a
something.
bit chalk and cheese, weren't they? Really, those some of those
Yeah, they're
characters.
two bands you wouldn't have necessarily put together. Now, REM, like I said, I probably would have put with like Radiohead. That's where my thing ends,
Yeah, for
really.
sure. I mean, obviously they must have been put on the same bill because they were big at the time.
Was
Now,
it Slane Castle? I think it might have been
I think there
Slane
was
Castle.
that would have been the tour '95 for this album, the tour when they were doing the Monster album. So, quick rehash. I have to say I've been an REM fan for a while, but I feel like a bit of a fraud REM fan because I obviously wasn't into them in the '80s when they'd started. They go back to the early '80s. US what they call the college rock scene. You know, these are the bands that weren't played on mainstream radio in America, but they were played on college radio, and they were on independent labels. And they signed after a few albums. They signed with Warner in, I think it was 87 or 88. Made the album Green. I heard little bits of that in around 1990 when I first started getting into sort of more alternative rock and exploring these kind of things. And so R.E.M. did kind of help shape my taste in a way, because they were one of the first of those kind of bands that I really got into. And I got into the Out of Time album, but I wasn't massively obsessed with them. But I really went all in on Automatic for the People. I was a really big fan of Automatic for the People. I was quite surprised when it became such a massive seller, because it's not really, in many ways, you wouldn't think it would be a very commercial album. It's quite downbeat, a lot of it, and
we're reviewing Monster.
Yeah, we're reviewing Monster.
Similar vein.
Similar vein, but just a lot more guitars and a lot noisier.
Yeah.
There is a song on Automatic for the People that kind of points the way to this album, which is the track Ignore Land, which is a rocking track where Michael Stipe's having a bit of a political rant. But this album isn't really a political album. This is more about sort of personal stuff. And Michael Stipe trying on characters, basically. And they were going to do this tour. They knew they were going to do a tour. They hadn't toured for 5 years. They just made a conscious decision that they were going to make an album that rocked more than the last two, which had been quite acoustic based. And so they were deliberately going for that kind of sound. And I think they were, to a certain extent as well, responding to the grunge thing in America, with Pearl Jam and Nirvana and all that kind of thing, that you had to be a little bit noisier. So I think that was part of it as well. Nirvana comes into this, of course, because one of the tracks is a tribute to Kurt Cobain, who was a big fan of R.E.M., a big admirer of them. And you've been doing some notes, Ben. I did a bit of research with this book. I hadn't read it for years. It's called R.E.M., Talk About the Passion, an oral history. And it's basically a load of interviews, clips of interviews with people who knew them throughout the various stages of their career. So it's quite interesting to read, because it's just a sort of commentaries from all these different people. But there's things, Mark Howard, the recording engineer, writes in here, they spent 10 days early on, before they actually recorded the album, they spent 10 days in New Orleans doing demos and things. So some of this album was done in New Orleans, and they spent about 4 months making it, apparently, according to Scott Litt, the producer, who remixed it recently for the 25th anniversary edition.
I see it's had a 25-year anniversary reissue. It's got a blue cover, if I remember rightly.
Yeah, it's I would say it's something that only R.E.M. nerds should be interested in. You get all the outtakes, but of course with R.E.M. the outtakes generally are basically instrumental tracks, because a lot of the time, well, that's how they write their songs. And I think the Smiths wrote their songs this way as well, in that the three instrumentalists in the band worked on these pieces of music. They came up with these sort of pretty much finished pieces of music, gave them to the singer, and Morrissey would then take this music for the Smiths and then write the song. And they didn't necessarily tell him what they thought it was going to be about. He would just come up with his own lyrical ideas, and that's what Michael Stipe did as well. And that's how R.E.M. worked. So there were a number of leftover tracks, which you can hear on that box set if you're so inclined. But I don't think there's any real leftover ones with lyrics. I think they were all instrumentals that were left over.
Yeah.
The lyrics of this album are interesting, but they're also quite buried in parts.
There was a lot of it where you couldn't really hear.
Which is part of it, and that was the thing with R.E.M. on their very early albums, that Michael sang in this quite deep voice and was quite mumbly.
Barry White.
Very early, well, if you listen to very early R.E.M., he's quite deep and mumbly, and you can't hear a lot of what he's singing on there. So that's kind of a bit of a trademark for them. In this remix, Scott Litt actually brought the vocals up a bit. Some people liked that. Some people thought it took the mystique away from the album and spoiled the balance. But anyway, that's a kind of a rough background to the album. Yeah. So, Ben, what's your reaction?
Well, my reaction is based over a couple of weeks, because when I first listened to it, I can't remember what my actual words to you were, but they were along the lines of, I won't be listening to that again. Something along those lines. To me, it sounds like it could have been, do you know when you get sort of... a band, a band that you liked in the 90s, so say like R.E.M, and you forget they're around in the 80s, and then you listen to one of their albums from the 80s, and you're like, oh yeah, they sound completely different now. That's what this album sounded like to me. It sounded like it was like an early, distant album that was far removed from obviously what you hear in the singles, because some of the tracks reminded me of. It wasn't an album track on the Stone Roses debut. The Misery Dictionary, that song, and it kind of reminded me of that, a little bit downbeat, and it was really hard to get into. I mean, I don't think the running order of it is particularly great, but I said to you earlier, I don't know how I'd reorder it, because it's what's the frequency Kenneth kicks it off, and that's kind of upbeat, oddly upbeat, compared to, I'd say, 70% of the stuff on it. The lyrics are a little bit dark. Never really sort of read the lyrics, but
It is quite dark. He's playing these various characters. I think some people think that the monster idea is that, and the bear face on the album cover is because Michael Stipe was trying on these different masks, and all these characters that he portrays in the songs are a bit dark. Really, they've got they've got some.
It's got a strangely upbeat to it because of that. What's the frequency, Kenneth? That bit there. But the rest of it's actually quite sort of darkish. It slows down a little bit at the end. But yeah, it's sort of, then you got Strange Currencies, which in a weird way is sort of like the precursor. It's so very similar musically to, if you listen to that and Everybody Hurts.
Yeah, it's kind of like, it was kind of like a sequel to that. Musically, there is a similar kind of repeating pattern.
There's a couple of tracks like that. I think there's another one, and I've written in my notes here.
Everybody Hurts with more electric guitar, basically.
Yeah, that's what I would probably say. And I did write somewhere in amongst the T-Rex, I said it could almost be the cousin to. I'll find it in a minute. That's no, I'll find it in a minute.
There's no rush.
When I've made my
I'm very impressed. I'm very impressed that you've done all these notes.
I've done notes. Look,
proper homework, that is.
I know, and yeah. So yeah, Strange Currencies, good song, slightly more upbeat, because I think the first couple of tracks were sort of, it's really hard to get into. It's like, oh god, well, you've kind of conned me with What's the Frequency, and then you get into the sort of the first tracks. I think it's Crush with Eyeliner, which I didn't really enjoy, but then you get like Star 69, which is quite upbeat, probably the most upbeat song on the record, really, to be fair. And then you've got Tongue. Is it Tongue? Which is about Cunnilingus, apparently.
Some people have said that, and some people say it's. But I don't. It's Michael Stipe playing a part of a woman. He said that he's playing a part of this woman who's.
I quite like the Hammond organ on that.
I think it's this woman. He's playing a part of a woman who's being used by someone in a relationship. So she's a kind of a victim in a way, and it's a kind of she's being used by this man. Apparently, I've not analysed it in that much depth. See, I've always quite liked the album, but I can't totally explain why. I think it's the thing with R.E.M. is that I've always found that a lot of their songs take a while to sink in, and sometimes that can take weeks, sometimes it can take months, and sometimes it can take years. But I've always quite liked the sound of it. I mean, I do like noisy feedback electric guitar stuff that's a bit arty and a little bit out there. So maybe it's just that I like, and I quite like the mysterious, dark nature of the whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, it did get easier with every listen. It did get sort of easier. I did quite like the Hammond organ. I'm sure it's a Hammond organ. It sounds like one in.
There is one in there, yeah.
So I did quite like that. I did, because he's got that quite gospel-y vocal, hasn't it? He's very sort of
Yeah, some people have said have suggested it might be Michael Stipe doing a Prince impersonation, because he's kind of singing it falsetto, and maybe that was the idea of it. But I don't know whether that was.
To be fair, that What's the Frequency and Star 69 are probably my three favourite tracks on there. Yeah, I think so. Anyway, but
Star 69 does rock quite a lot. Apparently, Star 69 is. the American version of the number that you used to dial to hear who'd rung you. And in this country, it
Oh
was
yes, yeah,
we
star
had
69.
we
Yes,
had
yeah,
one
yeah.
four seven one, didn't we? Or that,
One.
but
God,
apart,
oh God, mate, is that still going? Do you reckon?
I think it does still work on a landline. Yeah,
Does
yeah.
it? Who has a
So
landline? Have you got one, Phil?
you got to have well, people do have landlines. People
I
do have
don't.
them.
Oh, my dad does. My dad does.
Yeah.
If everybody wants to call him, I will give his phone number out at the end of this show. He'll love that.
Well,
Ooh,
he just rang you before the show. We could have put him on. We could have
we
asked
could
him
have
what
put him on, yeah.
could have asked him what
Well,
he
he
thought
did.
of
He
Monster.
did come on our radio show once, didn't he? Pretending to
Oh
be
yeah, yeah,
somebody to
yeah.
wind us up. Remember
That's
that?
right. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Wasn't he in a phone box, or was he pretending to be in a
He
phone
was
box?
pretending. I think he
That's
did
right.
something with his voice, and he was all
That's
like,
right.
So, but yeah, I mean, yeah, Tongue was a good song. Bang, is it Bang and Blame?
That's the one.
Um,
Yeah.
that's the other one. It's very similar. That's the one I was looking for. It's very similar. Similar. God, my speech today. It's very similar to Losing My Religion musically.
Is it?
If you
That's an
listen to
interesting.
it, the guitar, it's got an angsty lyric in that to it, but the guitar and the sort of almost like the not the beat of it, but the speed of it. If you listen to the two of them,
You think it's a cousin song? Could be a bit of
I
a
think it's
cousin.
a cousin to. I mean, they've probably got nothing to do with each other, but I found it quite. There's certain parts of the guitars and that where I thought, oh, that could have a little bit of Losing My Religion, that one, and vocally and lyrically as well. So, but I said they weren't bad tracks. Just some of them just disturbed my head after a while.
Well, the three that I found quite hard to get into when I first got the album were the closing trio, because they're quite unusual. You've got Let Me In, which is this one that was put together quite quickly, apparently, as a tribute to Kurt Cobain, and it's quite dark
Would you want me
and
to read you my notes on that
yeah.
song?
Go give us your notes. Let's see what
Let
you
Me In.
think.
I put obviously a Kurt Cobain tribute with a lot of distorted guitar. Almost sounds like a demo, but you know that it isn't. You know that it isn't a demo, but it kind of sounds like. I put a fuzz packed song that is a hard listen unless you're in the mood.
Yeah, maybe probably true. Yeah.
So that's what I put for that one. And then I'll go through my notes, dude. I put I Took Your Name, which I quite enjoyed. It's quite Joy Division-y.
Yeah, I like that track quite a lot. That's one
Yeah,
of the
yeah,
ones that I've gone back to quite a lot and sometimes picked out on its own to listen to. Do you know what that's got
yeah,
in common with think of the Beatles' White Album, right? Revolution
yeah,
1. Revolution
yeah.
1. Do you know what those two tracks have got in common with each other?
Go on.
Well, John Lennon apparently recorded the vocal for Revolution 1 lying on his back in the studio. In fact, there's a
Yeah.
photo. There's a photo of that to prove it. Michael Stipe was apparently lying on his back on a couch when he sang "I Took Your Name."
Ah, I love lying on a
So
couch. I'm
I
not
don't
gonna lie to
know.
you.
I'm not sure whether Michael got the idea from the fact that John Lennon had done it, or whether he just did it spontaneously. I'm not quite sure, but you can't really tell. But there you go.
Well, I did put here that it doesn't sound like Michael Stipe on the vocals. He sounds a little. It was bugging me for ages. I thought sounds a little Iggy Pop, but it's not
Well,
Iggy Pop.
well,
But
there's
it
something.
sound.
Well, there's one of the lyrics in there. It's interesting that you say that, because in one of the lyrics, you possibly haven't noticed it yet, there is a bit where he sings, "I want to be Iggy Pop, but if that's what it takes."
That
So
might be where it comes from, because I thought but it doesn't. It's very New Yorky, I would say, that sort of thing.
yeah, yeah,
But
I
it
get
does,
that. Yeah, it does. Yeah, it's that kind of
so I
thing.
put it. It sounds like Iggy Pop mixed with something I know, but I can't remember what it is.
I do like the
Uh,
guitar riff on that, and I do like the sort of the whole style and sound of that one. I
yeah,
like.
yeah. Well, I did actually put if you remove the vocal and just had the backing track, that could have been an Oasis track. If
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, yeah. It was a
it's
bit.
got that
Yeah, I
sort
know
of
what you're saying. I know
yeah,
what you mean.
yeah.
Yeah.
So that's what I put about that. I sort of it was good. It bugged me, and it's still bugging me now because it's not Iggy Pop. It sounds similar to Iggy Pop, but it's something else. It's
Sort of
yeah,
Lou
it's an
Reed or
eclectic mix.
something like
Yeah, well,
that. Yeah.
that's what I put. I put Lou Reed. Could quite easily be Lou Reed. So yeah,
Yeah. So I took your name. You're quite taken with "I Took Your Name."
yeah. Like I said, it could quite easily have been an Oasis track. I think. Not so much the vocal and the lyrics, but certainly the backing track
I know what
itself.
you mean. Yeah. So what about Circus Envy?
I put here
Which
it starts off all T-Rex. I said it
yeah.
starts off all T-Rex with more fuzz, distorted guitar, and an Ian Brown-like vocal to start off. If you before the sort of rise comes in, it starts off with a very T-Rex and Ian Brown vocal.
To me, it's the most monstrous track on Monster. It's quite scary.
Yeah, well, all these were quite dark in a way.
It is quite dark. Yeah.
It wasn't a light album, you know.
No, it wasn't
It's
shiny,
not.
happy people times 10, was it?
No. This certainly isn't going to be covered by Steps anytime soon, you know. So, but yeah, that like I said, it was a good. These were all good tracks, but some of them were hard work. I could see why people like them, and I could see why people don't like them. Like I say, it's taken me 3 or 4 listens to get to a stage where I could palette some of them.
Yeah. You see, as far as arty guitar rock albums go of the 90s, if I compare this with OK Computer by Radiohead, I would not try to argue that this is a better album than OK Computer. I think objectively, OK Computer is a greater achievement, I think. But I've listened to this a lot more than I've listened to OK Computer. I don't know exactly why that is.
Yeah, I'm not, as you well know, a massive fan of, and that sounds wrong when I say massive fan. It just means I just don't, there's other artists I prefer. But I would prefer to listen to OK Computer over this album.
Yeah, it's a weird one. Obviously, it's partly because I have more of a fan relationship with R.E.M. and also this album rocks a bit more, so it's sort of, I want something that rocks a bit. Whereas OK Computer, you have to be in the mood for something a bit dark and psychological, don't you?
Yeah. And then,
mind you, this is dark and psychological as well.
It is very, yeah. It was. Do you know what it reminded me of? In the way it made me feel listening to it at first was Bruce Springsteen's Nebraska album.
In terms of the fact that it's quite dark, yeah,
dark, and it was real hard listening to. But then we get on to You, not You, but the track You, and I put very similar to the previous 3 tracks the tracks that preceded it, with a sort of Eastern style guitar riffed through it. It's very
there is something a little bit exotic about that guitar.
I didn't mind You. I thought it was a good track.
To me, it was a cousin of. I haven't heard it for a long time, but there's a track on the Green album by R.E.M. called "I Remember California," which it just has a sort of similar vibe and mood to me. I don't think it's musically the same, but always reminds me of that for some reason. But he gets quite. He sounds quite. What's the word? Psychotic on this.
Yeah,
he sounds a bit. It's Michael Stipe is playing a lot of characters on this, and it's quite extreme. Some of it's almost like it could be the soundtrack to some kind of serial killer movie.
Yeah. I mean, Ted Bundy's probably got this on all day long, And then I got to Crush with Eyeliner because some of these are out of sync. I didn't really enjoy that song. I think it was a single off of the album, and I just put it could have been Roxy Music. It could have been sung by Lou Reed, is what I put for that track.
Yeah, it's a bit like that. I mean, that's the one where the guest vocalist is Thurston Moore of Sonic Youth, but it doesn't really add very much because Thurston Moore doesn't play any guitar on it, so it doesn't really have anything. His contribution is there, but it doesn't really make much difference to the record.
Yeah.
So, if he played his guitar all over it, it might have been something different. But
and then we get to King of Comedy. It wasn't very funny.
No,
that's what I'm going to say. Don't put on the King of Comedy expecting laughs.
It's kind of weirdly funky though, isn't it? And it's got this groovy guitar riff. Again, they've got riffs and hooks on this album that sort of eventually bury themselves in your head, but it's kind of weird at first.
Yeah. I mean, I've been to car crashes funnier than this track, but I just put on that. I just put it's got a cool distorted vocal. I quite like the vocal on it, but this is probably not a compliment. but in a way it didn't sound like, because they would have sounded like this, but it sounded a little bit Babylon Zoo.
Okay. It is
Not
weird.
the
I'll give it that.
yeah. It sounded a little bit. Even the vocal was a little bit jazz man in a way. I could sort of. This could quite easily have been a Babylon Zoo song, and I've not listened to that many Babylon Zoo songs. So, and then last but not least, which I've had to write at the top of the page, and I've had to put it upside down, was "I don't sleep, I dream," and I put in the way that it feels sonically and sort of the way that the track moves on. I said it's almost a precursor to The Great Beyond. It's got a very similar vocal. It's got a very similar beat to it and a very similar rhythm to it. The two could. There's a lot of cousin songs on this. There's a lot of inbreeding going on.
Yeah, okay. I'll have to check. I haven't thought of that, but I'll have to check that
Yeah,
out.
it's not sort of saying not the whole track. Like some of these cousin ones we've discussed with, there's just bits in it where you go, I've heard that, and you can sort of see where it's come in those later tracks. But if you put "I Sleep, I Dream" on, there's just something about his vocal and the guitar. Just something that there's a couple of lines that he sings in it, and it's the way he hits the note at the end of the certain words. It could quite easily be a cousin. It's much like the royal family, isn't it? They're all sort of related
Yeah.
in a way. So, but yeah, I mean, like I said, I can see why it's good. I can see why people like it. I can see why people don't like it. If I was on a desert island and I had to choose 10 albums, this one is well back, left at home. That's what I'm going to say. Musically merited, it's better than anything I could do. It was hard work, but with every listen, it got better, which can only be a good thing. But I wouldn't put it in my top 10 favourite albums.
So we'll just have to wait another 5 years until you'll love it then, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, I hated the Smiths when I was a kid, and I like the Smiths now. So, so it could happen. Phil, it could happen. But it was hard. It was hard work. Like I said, it reminded me a lot of Nebraska by the Brucey.
So that's Ben's verdict on the orange one, R.E.M's Monster. He has given it a kind of mixed review, really, in a way, isn't it?
I would say a mixed review. I would say a 5.5 out of 10. A 5.5. Phil and Ben's.
Didn't love it, didn't hate it. Kind of. Was it fair to say you didn't love it, didn't hate it? You kind of respect it, but you haven't totally
respect
attached
it.
yourself.
Yeah, I think it's. I like the sort of the fact that it is different. I would imagine compared to a lot of major albums in '95, it's got a completely different sound to it than a lot of those sort of albums. So it is different. I respect it for what it is. Didn't necessarily enjoy it fully, but I've got a better understanding for the R.E.M. And I've got to say one thing. I do like Michael Stipe's lyrics as well. I do quite like the sort of the nonsensicalness of them in a way.
Yeah.
They don't mean anything, but they mean everything. If that means anything.
And there's some quite unusual stream of consciousness ones on this album. But yeah, so we may be slowly doing it, Ben. We may be slowly getting a bit more into R.E.M. But
we could do. I may have to revisit other albums. I may enjoy them.
So the question, dear viewer, is what do you think of R.E.M. and what do you think of Monster? Have you heard it? Do you have memories of it? Do you have a big, strong opinion of it either way? And have you got as many notes on it as Ben had? Thanks for that one, Ben. That was a really... you did your homework on that one for sure.
Did my homework. Yeah, you can tell my mum and dad they'll have done good because that's the first and only homework I've ever done on my own without copying anybody else.
Gold star on the way. Thanks for watching. Very soon. All the best.